सुरमा सहा ना जाए आचरदार जिन नैनन में पी बसे दूजा कौन समाए
जिन नैनन में पी बसे तो दूजा कौन
अपनी छब बनाए के जो मैं पी के पास गई छब देखी पीहू की तो मैं अपनी भूल गई छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे मुँह से छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे मुँह से मैं ना मिलाएंगे
छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे मुँह से मैं ना मिलाएंगे
छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे मुँह से मैं ना मिलाएंगे
छाप तिलक सब
नैना मिलाइके छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे
छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे मुँह से नैना मिलाएंगे
नैना मिलाइके मुझसे नैना लड़ाई के
नैना मिलाके मुँह से नैना लड़ाई के
नैना मिलाइके मुझसे नैना लड़ाई के
नैना मिलाके मुँह से
नैना मिलाइके नैना मिलाइके नैना लड़ाई के नैना मिलाइके मुझसे नैना लड़ाई के
नैना मिलाके मुँह से नैना लड़ाई के
बात अगम कह दी रे मुझसे नैना मिलाई के
बातें अगम कह दी बातें अगम कह दी बातें अगम कह दी
बात अगम कह दी रे मुझसे नैना मिलाई के बल बल जाऊं बल बल जाऊं बल बल जाऊं मैं तोरे रंग रजवा
बल बल जाऊं तोरे रंग
रजवा बल बल जाऊं मैं
तोरे रंग रजवा
बल बल आ आ मैं तोरे रंग रजवा बल बल जाऊं मैं
तोरे रंग रजवा
बल बल जाऊं मैं तोरे रंग रजवा बल बल जाऊं मैं
तोरे रंग
रजवा अपनी सी रंग दी नीले मुझसे नैना मिलाई के
अपनी सी रंग दी मेरे मुँह से नैना मिलाएंगे
अपनी सी रंग दी नीले मुझसे नैना मिलाई के
अपनी सी रंग दी मेरे
मुझसे नैना मिलाई के मुझसे नैना मिलाई के मुझसे नैना मिलाई के मुझसे
नैना मिलाएंगे
मुझसे नैना मिलाई के मुझसे नैना मिलाई के खुसरो निजाम के बात जुलागी
खुसरो निजाम के बात चलानी
खुसरो निजाम
बात जुलानी
मोह सुहागन की नीरे मुझसे नैना मिलाए
मोह सुहागन की
गा मा दा नी रा गा गा रे रे सा दा नी नी रा रा पा मा गा रे सा पा मा गा रे सा पा मा गा रे सा मोह सुहागन की नीरे मुझसे नैना मिलाए
मोह सुहागन
गा रा मा नी दा सा सा नी सा नी सा नी सा नी सा नी दा पा मा गा रे सा नी दा पा मा गा रे सा नी धा पा मा गा रे सा सुहागन की नीले मुझसे नैना मिलाएंगे
मोह सुहागन की नीरे मुझसे नैना मिलाएंगे
पार मांगा पार मांगा मादानी दा पार मांगा बाबा माधा पार मांगा Baba re mama ma ga re Baba re mama ma re ga ga re sa re sa Baba re mama ma re ga ga re sa re sa Baba re mama ma re ga ga re sa re sa Baba re mama ma re ga ga re sa re sa Nire sa nire sa nire sa 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 Nire sa nire sa nire sa 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 Nire sa nire sa nire sa 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 Nire sa sa Nire sa nire sa nire sa sa सुहागन की सुहागन की सुहागन की मोह सुहागन की नैना मिलाए
मोह सुहागन की नीरे मुझसे
मोह से नैना मिलाए के मोह सुहागन की नैना मिलाए
मोह सुहागन की नीरे मुझसे नैना मिलाएंगे
मोह से नैना मोह से नैना मोह से नैना मिलाए के
मोह से नैना
मिलाए के मोह से नैना मिलाए के
मोह से नैना मिलाएंगे
मोह से नैना मिलाए के
मोह से नैना मिलाएंगे
मोह से नैना मिलाए के
मोह से नैना मिलाएंगे
छाप तिलक सब छीनी रे सब छीनी नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
सब छीनी नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
सब छीनी नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
मेरा खामोश मेरा खामोश मेरा खामोश रहकर भी उन्हें सब कुछ बता देना सब छीनी सब छीनी सब छीनी सब छीनी नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
सब छीनी नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
सब छीनी नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
नजर से नजर में मुलाकात कर ली रहे हम तो खामोश पर बात समझ ली उसने मुँह से नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
सब छीनी नैना मिलाए के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
तेरी आंखें हैं जिंदगी मेरी तेरी खातिर है शायरी मेरी मैंने समझा के बाहर आई है मैंने समझा के बाहर आई है जब तुझ पर नजर पड़ी मेरी समझीनी नैना मिलाई के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
सब चीनी नैना मिलाई के
चीनी नैना
सब चीनी नैना मिलाई
सब
के
चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे चीनी नैना मिलाएंगे
सब चीनी नैना मिलाई के
चीनी नैना
मिलाई के छाप तिलक सब चीनी रे
आप तिलक सब चीनी रे
मोह से छाप तिलक सब चीनी रे नैना मिलाई के नैना मिलाई के नैना मिलाई के
this, our IT person he'll adjust the volume as necessary for the space, so you don't have to worry about it. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Pamela Cooper-White. I am the Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Union Theological Seminary. And on behalf of our President, Serene Jones, and myself, I want to just enthusiastically welcome you to this event on the 150th anniversary of the birth of Gandhi. We're so delighted that you're all here, and honored and delighted to have this panel of distinguished guests with us to share their thoughts and their work with you tonight. What does this have to do with Union's vision? Union has a small motto that's taken from our larger mission statement, that we are the place where faith and scholarship meet to reimagine the work of justice. And these speakers tonight are all committed to that work of justice. John Tatamanal will be introducing each of them shortly, but this whole event is really central to what we do here at Union, both in our curriculum and in our public programming, which is we are now a seminary that's historically progressive Christian. We have always been progressive. We have always been engaged in the work of justice in the community and beyond. We are also deeply committed to interreligious engagement, and that's an increasing commitment that we have and an increasing part of our programming, both in terms of our curriculum and in terms of our public program. So this event could not be more tailor-made for the kind of commitments that we have here at Union, and we're happy to have you here with us tonight. I want to especially thank by name our donor, Mary Coelho, for funding the Insight Project of Union, which is a part of our overall program here at Union and which is the sponsor of tonight's event. The Insight Project was developed with Mary's vision in order to provide for us a forum where exciting, cutting-edge theological reflection and engagement can happen around commitments to the natural sciences and the social sciences and all manner of modern secular concerns which are brought into dialogue with our theological concerns and our commitment to justice. So with that, I welcome you here tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I'm going to introduce our director of the Insight Project, who is the Associate Professor of Theology and Religions here at Union, John Tatamanal, who will introduce our speakers.
Let me add my welcome also to all of you and to our distinguished speakers. We begin our time together remembering that we gather on the lands of the Lenape people. Among the themes that we have taken especially seriously in the Insight Project is attention to the climate crisis, nature, land, and the meaning of place. There is no way to think seriously about any of these topics without rectifying our relationship to First Nations people from whom we have yet so much to learn. Now, Pam has already wonderfully introduced the Insight Project. For the sake of time, I won't say much more about that, except that we really are committed to reimagining what theology ought to be. Not merely a kind of doctrinal exercise, but deep religious reflection in conversation with the best of the natural, social, and human sciences. Our theme this year is the feeling animal, affect, practice, and theology. And I could be sidetracked quite considerably by going on at some length about what Gandhi has to say about the question of feelings and affect and practice. I think that's among the many things that we could speak about today. I want to just briefly introduce you to the format of the evening. introduce our speakers, and say a few things by way of framing this evening's reflections on Gandhi. So I'll offer a brief introduction to our speakers, some framing remarks, and then I'll pass the baton to Ruchira Gupta, who will moderate the conversation. Each of our speakers will offer a kind of 10-minute opening statement, and then they'll be in conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll bring you into the conversation. Now, let me say who they are, though I suspect many of you know a great deal about who our speakers are. Ruchira Gupta, our moderator, is a feminist campaigner, journalist, visiting professor at NYU, and founder of the Indian anti-sex trafficking organization Apne Aap. She has helped more than 20,000 girls, women, and their family members exit prostitution systems. She testified to the U.S. Senate for the passage of the first U.S. Trafficking Victim Protection Act and has led survivors after the December 16th bus rape for a new Indian anti-trafficking law. She has advocated for the creation of the Trafficking Fund for Survivors at the United Nations by addressing the UN General Assembly and taking survivors to speak there, and to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And then this list of very impressive awards and distinctions. She has won an Emmy, the Clinton Global Citizen Award, the UN NGO CSW Woman of Distinction Award, and the highest French civilian distinction, the Knight of the National Order of Merit. Her work is influenced by the Gandhian principles of ahimsa and antodaya, uplift of the last. She dreams of a world in which no human being is bought or sold. Gloria Steinem is known to all of us. She's a writer, lecturer, political activist, and feminist organizer. She travels in this and other countries as an organizer and lecturer, and is a frequent media spokeswoman on issues of equality. She's particularly interested in the shared origins of sex and race caste systems, gender roles, and child abuse as roots of violence. And she's also interested in nonviolent conflict resolution, the cultures of indigenous peoples, and organizing across boundaries for peace and justice. She lives here in New York and first traveled to India in the 1950s, where she learned about Gandhian organizing. Akeel Bilgrami is quite local to the neighborhood. He is the Sidney Morgenbesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia. He's a faculty of the Committee on Global Thought. His chapters on Gandhi as philosopher in his book Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, published by Harvard University Press in 2014, are among the finest writings on Gandhi's significance for philosophy and theology that I have ever read. He's also working on a book on Gandhi's philosophy, situating Gandhi's thought in 17th century dissent in England and Europe, and more broadly within the Radical Enlightenment and the radical strand in the Romantic tradition. He's also the editor of Marx, Gandhi, and Modernity. We are fortunate indeed to have these three luminaries with us. Now, let me just say a few words by way of framing our conversation. So, about 2 weeks ago, I told a friend of mine, a very knowledgeable person, a non-Indian, that I was writing an op-ed to commemorate the 150th birthday of Mohandas Gandhi. And this otherwise extremely well-informed person said, "Mohandas? Do you mean Mahatma?" And this isn't the first time this has happened to me, where very learned, otherwise very learned people have come to believe that Mahatma is not a title, meaning great soul, but his given name at birth. It's a puzzling phenomena because it affects a kind of erasure. One might say that the Mahatma has erased Mohandas. The trouble with that is that Gandhi's critics on both the left and the right say he is no Mahatma. About this is the only point on which the left and the right can possibly agree. So on the left, you have gender critics. You have critics of Gandhi's sexual practices. You have critics on questions of anti-black racism during his time in South Africa. And you have critics like Ambedkar and others from raising questions about Dalits and what remains unthought in Gandhi's reflections. So here we have a second erasure, if you will. You have this historical legacy in which the Mahatma has erased Mohandas, and now a number of voices have said there is no Mahatma. So then what remains? That, it seems to me, is one way to frame the concerns of how do we live robustly with a thinker that without either dismissing through vilification or through uncritical adulation. Is there work that remains to be done in our collective reflection that avoids either of those polarities, either of those dichotomies? And my feeling is a definitive yes. I'm haunted by a sense that even on the very central concepts of Gandhi's philosophies, the most studied features of his thought, we have yet to begin to learn from him. And I'll just give one example. I think that we have been mystified by his insistence that there is this intimate and inseparable connection between truth and nonviolence. There's almost a principle of convertibility. Truth just is nonviolence. Nonviolence just is truth. And the one who practices and acquires the capacity to see the truth by overcoming in oneself those impulses that prevent us from even wanting to see the truth, acquire a kind of power to engage in nonviolent resistance. All that sounds esoteric and puzzling for many of us, but we live in a time in which, through flagrant negative example, we have someone who shall go unnamed, who has told over 12,000 lies since inauguration. And somehow, in a peculiar way, he illumines the principle by its very negation, that there is some profound intimacy between falsehood and violence, that these two are utterly inseparable in some fashion. And in a way, he can help us perhaps understand the converse proposition. So I don't think we've even begun to understand this, and this may be perhaps the most well-studied feature of his thought. So, and then we know that at the early decades of the last century, we had immense contributions from Gandhi on economics, ecological thinking, and anti-colonialism. And all these features of his thought also remain over a century ahead of his time. So I think there's a lot of work left for us to do, and I think it is our great and good pleasure that we have these three thinkers with us to help us think about these themes, which are very much on my mind. I suspect you have other ones also. So let's welcome them and prepare for an engaging evening.
Thank you, John, for the wonderful introduction and much food for thought as we begin today's conversation. And I want to emphasize the word conversation because I have two great thinkers sitting on both sides of me, and they will reflect somewhat on the relevance of Gandhi in our times as much as he was relevant in the biggest anti-colonial struggle in his lifetime, which impacted on the whole world across continents and cultures. But also to talk to all of you who are sitting here, to understand what do you think is the relevance of Gandhi today. Clearly you all are here exploring something. In both our countries we have toxic masculinity, which has arisen once again after 100 years or so. And Gandhi, of course, exemplified through the means of his freedom struggle how he took on the brute masculinity of the British Empire. And everything that he did, from his first satyagraha in Champaran, where he had gone to document the plight of indigo farmers who had been exploited beyond even life to the point of death and beyond. And he went to document this, and he would not leave that town when the British authorities told him to leave, saying he would follow the law of a higher conscience. And he stayed there, he was arrested. That was his first act of satyagraha, or argument for truth, on Indian soil. And of course, that satyagraha led to many more satyagrahas and multiple satyagrahas later. The most famous, which you all know of, two satyagrahas. One was the salt satyagraha, where he broke the salt tax. And by marching to the sea and picking up a fistful of salt, he made Indians, millions of Indians, realize across the country that there was the possibility of challenging the most powerful with a simple act of picking up a fistful of salt from the sea. The other important satyagraha that you all know about, of course, is the one he called Quit India, where he simply told the British, leave India. And he said this peacefully, and he would keep encouraging young men and women to fill up the jails and boycott British-made goods as an act of satyagraha. So why did he call his movement satyagraha is something which concerns us all today, because satya, as the word in Hindi means, is truth, and agra means the argument for truth. This is what Gandhi's entire life was about, the argument for truth. And today we are being bombarded with fake news. Many of you know how elections have been hacked into through fake news in both our countries, in India and the US, and how the manipulation of our minds through this fake news is making us make choices which take us towards falsehood rather than truth. So where does the truth lie when the false is presented as the truth? And John Thatamanil today spoke about the fact that the person who should not be named, who's spoken a million lies in his rise to power, and he's the Prime Minister of India today. I will name him. Narendra Modi today wrote an op-ed in New York Times praising Gandhi. Now, Modi himself comes from a group called the RSS, who had actually corresponded with Hitler and went and met with Mussolini to found certain principles for their organization in 1929. And one of the reasons they decided to found it was actually to challenge Gandhi and his principles of non-violence, but also more importantly to challenge Gandhi because he was breaking all hierarchies inside Indian society in his struggle for freedom. The first hierarchy that he tried to break, which most of you may be surprised to hear, is the hierarchy of patriarchy. The 1 year that Gandhi spent after coming back from South Africa was traveling into homes, into societal small groups, and the meetings for him were being organized by women from the Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj, who would talk to him about their issues, which was female illiteracy, which was the parda, which was widow remarriage, not being allowed, women were being married very early. And these kind of issues, and this is what Gandhi learned while traveling through, that women were colonized inside the homes, and therefore the idea of colonization became normal for all the peoples in the country who then subjugated themselves under British colonialism. So he realized very quickly that he would have to fundamentally go inside the homes of Indians to create a mass struggle, and he chose tactics which would be appealing to women, and many of those tactics, as you know, are satyagraha. But satyagraha, the argument of truth, also became a spiritual force for him, which again attracted women, and therefore the Indian freedom struggle actually offered to the world a possibility of a way of challenging the most powerful in a non-violent and peaceful way, but also the inclusion of all, from the bottom to the top. And so there were Rajas and there were Zamindars and people in authority who participated, but there was also that little housewife who would spin a charkha and participate. And this is what Gandhi did. So when we talk about Modi, what he has done today is that through this process, he, in writing an op-ed in praise of Gandhi, what he has done is actually subverted something inside his own political group, which was founded as a challenge to Gandhi because they thought that Gandhi was breaking down the hierarchy, not just of gender. And Godse, his assassin, who comes from the same political group as Modi, actually went on to say that he actually assassinated Gandhi because Gandhi was uprooting the hierarchy of gender. The other thing that Gandhi went on to uproot was the hierarchy of caste. The caste that he challenged was, he said that nobody is born untouchable and everybody, every human being has God inside himself. And so he called this person the Daridra Narayan, and he called the most oppressed caste, he used a phrase called Harijan, children of God, to talk about them. Now, over the years, of course, we may say this was still patronizing, his attitude to women, his attitude to caste, but the fact is that he was the first political leader to make these issues into a mass struggle and bring leaders from these castes and these sexes along to take on the issues that we are dealing with today. Now, what Modi has done by writing an op-ed in praise of the Mahatma has actually rejected something in his own party, which Godse, the assassin of Gandhi, actually articulated in court trials after the assassination. Godse said Mahatma Gandhi was trying to uproot gender, which would destroy the Indian family. He was trying to uproot and destroy caste hierarchy, which would destroy Indian society, and therefore Hinduism, because the founder of RSS had actually defined Hinduism as Hindutva, which was a militarized ideology based on creating these hierarchies. And the fact that the Prime Minister who's emerged from this group is saying that itself is a victory of Gandhi. And that he has to talk about Gandhi when he comes to America at the United Nations or in New York Times, and he cannot get away from that. Based on just these few observations, I would like Gloria Steinem, who traveled to India in the 1950s and learned about Gandhian organizing by literally going into villages afflicted by caste riots and learning what actually organizing from the bottom up meant. I would like her to make some remarks.
I think part of the greatness of Mahatma is that he has brought us together here. And I think each of us probably has a story as to why we are here. So I will tell you my story, but you have to promise me in the conversation to tell us your story, because I think it tells us the worldwide inspiration and beyond inspiration, change of behavior that Gandhi truly is. I encountered Gandhi because my mother and both my grandmothers, even though one was Christian, one was Jewish, and my parents were the mixed marriage of their generation, nonetheless, they had all become theosophists. Does theosophy ring a bell? Yes. And therefore, there was a consciousness of Gandhi which probably wasn't that prevalent. Krishnamurti, I believe, was the main, although he was still very young too. And Annie Besant, yes, were the writers people knew. This somehow stayed with me in the way that I bet stayed with you, right? And so when I was a senior in college and I was engaged to get married and did not want to get married, I felt I had to go very far away, and I thought surely that should be India. So I somehow got a small scholarship for $1,000, and I sat in the Pan Am, I remember Pan Am office, until finally they gave me a ticket to get rid of me. And I went to India, and I was very fortunate to live in Miranda House, as you know, the women's college at the University of Delhi. But I was even more fortunate because as I was wandering around, taking trains, you know, the women's car of trains in India, the third-class car and so on, I somehow intersected with a group of Gandhians. Of course, Gandhi was no longer alive by that time. We're talking 1957. a group of Gandhians who were going through an area called Ramnad because there had been caste riots there, and they were, the whole area had been cordoned off. People felt abandoned, they didn't know, they had no communication. So these Gandhians were walking through the villages to hold meetings around a kerosene lamp at night in the middle of the village, because they said to me, if you want to know how people live, you have to go where they live. If you want, this is all the Gandhian principles. If you want people to listen to you, you have to listen to them. All of the even-handed, perfectly genius but simple principles of Gandhi. So I did end up walking with them with only a cup, a sari, and a comb, and we couldn't carry anything. And seeing Gandhian organizing tactics at work, and seeing the gradual disappearance of terror and vindictiveness, because people sat in a circle and each one told his or her story and was listened to, and discovered that they were not alone. They had felt abandoned by the government. They had felt, completely isolated and endangered. And somehow those Gandhian simple tactics of walking there, listening, everyone telling their story, sharing their story, sitting in a circle. I mean, a circle is our absolute primordial way of being. We cannot empathize with each other unless we are together physically. It's all very well to look at a screen, and I love books, but you can't empathize that way. I asked a neurologist who told me that oxytocin, the hormone that allows you to empathize, the tendon befriend hormone, is only produced when we're physically together. I know not whether Gandhi knew about oxytocin, but he practiced oxytocin. And that experience profoundly, profoundly changed me. Now, I did not think that it was applicable in this country. It seemed very distant, after all. India was distant. And it wasn't until the 70s when I went back to India and with my friend Devaki Srinivasan Jain, someone, I say both her names because maybe in one of those names you know, we had what we thought was a genius idea, which was we were going to write down in a very readable way Gandhian organizing tactics, because being nonviolent, we thought they would be very useful and applicable to women's movements around the world. So we read Gandhi's letters. I mean, that's mostly the way he communicated, through his letters. We did all the research we possibly could. And we also went to see a great woman, I hope you know, named Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. And she had actually worked with Gandhi for many, many years, had been in a way, the founder or the advocate of keeping handicrafts as a very major presence and source of art and livelihood. But because she had actually worked with Gandhi, we went to see her, and we sat on her veranda and we told her about our project at great length, and she listened to us very patiently, and when we finished, she said, "Well, my dear, we taught him everything he knew." And by which she meant that, as Ruchira has been saying, that he learned from women as well as from men. He learned not just at the spinning wheel, but also the whole ethos of being a whole person, not just a masculine person, which meant adding a feminine person to be a whole person. And I never forgot her saying that, because though she was in no way diminishing Gandhi or appropriating Gandhi, it just told me how often we, as female human beings, are attracted to something without knowing that it's ours. Who was it who said, I worshipped great men for their strength, forgetting I was strong? Something. So I think his wholeness, that is his, in a way, denial of gender and recognition of whole humanity, has made him a way more universal figure than almost any other national or international global figure I can think of. And of course, he here in this country has had huge influence, even though he never set foot on this country, in this country. I realized that over again when I began to work with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, who in California were organizing migrant workers. And it turned out to be Gandhian philosophy and organizing tactics that had inspired Cesar Chavez, who was himself a farm worker, uneducated, had never left the country. So it is such a lesson as to how one person who actually dares to be a whole person. Sometimes I think the world is divided into two kinds of people, those who divide it into two and those who don't, right? Who is a whole person and who acts consistently and learns consistently admits to being wrong or learning something new, or what a huge beacon of hope and influence that person can be. And that person has brought us together tonight. Thank you.
I was thinking while Gloria was talking about another woman who was influenced by Gandhi in this country. Her name was Rosa Parks. She was a seamstress, and she actually went to the Highlander Institute and took a course in civil disobedience, which had been instituted there by a young Gandhian who went traveling there and said, you're teaching African Americans to resist, but haven't you talked to them about civil disobedience? And through the starting of that course there, what happened was that it led to Rosa Parks enlisting for it, and then her refusing to get up from the bus seat, and then Martin Luther King, and the whole history of the African American civil disobedience and civil resistance movement started from that. So there are so many linkages which go back and forth of how the powerless or the so-called powerless can take on the so-called powerful, and who becomes more powerful in the end. And Gandhi would, of course, talk about like the internal change as well as the external change every step of the way, which again Gloria spoke about when she said that how Gandhi said that he learned, Kamala Devi told her that Gandhi learned everything from women. And Gandhi himself writes how much he learned from women. He says, I learned about civil disobedience from my mother, who, when she wanted to take on an issue with his father, would fast, would not talk to him, and through that kind of passive resistance convert him. So he said he saw that at home first. Then he saw it when his wife organized with African coal miners to march for the right for intermarriage, which was stopped, or the right to move from one part of the country to another, or for the minimum wages of coal miners. And he kept learning. He says there's a very famous quote of Gandhi about his relationship with his own wife. He said he was conditioned like any other young man of his time to be a slave owner, the slave owner of his wife. He said till his wife resisted, and she opened his eyes, which then gave him his mission in life, to not be a slave owner, but also understand slavery and see how it could be uprooted fundamentally from inside the family. So Akeel, I would like you to take the conversation further. You have that mic for you.
Well, it's really very interesting for me to engage with Gandhi in the presence of Ruchira and Gloria because there's a side of Gandhi that I think they're both bringing out, which academic studies of Gandhi tend not to. And I'd very much like to hear more from them, and maybe I'll put questions to them, if they don't mind, as we go on. Let me just say a few things before that. I think Gloria raised a question which is very well worth posing and answering, and that is, why is it that perhaps more than virtually anybody that in the public sphere, Gandhi's name occurs again and again in conversations, in drawing rooms, in kitchens, and of course in libraries and seminars and lectures, not to mention books and journals and so on. So what is the power of, or the influence that is so abiding in a figure in public life? Now, one of the things that they've stressed is that it could not be that you can answer this question and leave out the fact that he was primarily an activist, that he mobilized with a kind of genius that nobody had hitherto possessed, millions of people. And, you know, when you look back, I don't believe that any other anti-imperialist thinker or activist was as great as Gandhi. I mean, there was Lenin, there was Fanon, and they both wrote about anti-imperialism, you know, the Palestinian thinkers like Edward Said, but there's something that Gandhi had as a gift for mobilization that even a Lenin did not have. And a good question to ask is, what made that possible? What property in Gandhi, what feature of Gandhi's personality and thought? And my own view has been, and much of my work has been, to say that you can't understand the activism without the thought. And I don't believe that Gandhi would be somebody whom we would incessantly talk about if he was merely an activist. That is, I think people, you sell people short if you think that they are incapable of following that he was a thinker who brought his ideas into the street or into the Maidan or into the vast expanse which he walked, for instance, in the Salt March. So there really is no way to separate the activism from the thought, and it's that integration of the two which I think makes him so interesting, not just for us as scholars and writers, but for the mass of people who followed him and followed other leaders who were inspired by him, like King and Chavez and others. So one of the things that drove me to study Gandhi was this, what I call his integrity, or the integration of his thought and his mobilizational effectiveness. Now, I don't think that you can understand his effectiveness as an activist unless you understand that he really wanted to bring onto center stage popular religion. And so it's not surprising to me that it's this institution which has organized this meeting and through people like John and so on has had a constant interest in Gandhi. You see, there were several different paths to mobilization in India. There was the left mobilization, which was more purely class struggle. There was the revolutionary insurgent anti-imperialism, which was often violent, and so on. And the idea that Gandhi could have in any way been one of those kinds of revolutionaries is to fail to understand how deeply popular religion was essential to his mobilization, to tap popular religion. And by popular religion, I really do mean a kind of religion that that is shared with animist traditions, with all sorts of, in India, Sufi Bhakti traditions. So by popular, I do really mean to stress popular. It's not high religion. So he brought together, so for instance, he was very interested in Christianity, but he was interested in Christ, the figure of Christ, the life of Christ, and not what in late antiquity became Orthodox Christianity. So he wanted to invest Christianity entirely in the exemplary life of one man, rather than a developing doctrine that emerged out of the, teachings and so on. He often was told that all this might be just a myth, and he would say, that's fine. And one way to think of it is that Christ may be humankind's noblest fiction. That's fine, but it had that exemplary effect. So popular religion was essential to his success. And I completely agree with Gloria that the thing that really made him different was that he was not, as a leader of men and women, a vanguardist. He was an essentially different kind of leader from, say, Lenin. Lenin brought to the people a theory. It was a doctrinal account, partly derived from Marx and Engels, with very, very shrewd additions and intellectually powerful additions by Lenin himself. But Lenin's idea, or the idea of Leninism, is the idea that the middle class, educated middle class, brings their theory to the mass of people. And mobilization takes place because this vanguard has a proper sense of the forward march of history, which they must lead the people to. The agents of transformative change will be the mass of people, but the ideas by which they will be guided will come from leaders. Gandhi didn't have that view. The idea of a satyagraha is the idea of a satyagrahi is the idea of a moral exemplar. It is not the idea of somebody who knows the forward march of history better. And so what Gloria stresses, that he was attentive, that wonderful remark of that you cited, that we taught him, that he was prepared to listen. The very interesting reading that Gloria gives of that remark is not that she was sneering at him, but that she was applauding him for being a listener, I think is just essential part of the vanguardism. The fact is, it's a very good question to ask. The masses are completely illiterate in that he was leading. So what does it mean to say that he will let them instruct him about the movement? What does it mean to say that? And I think the idea here is that when it comes to politics and public life, people don't have to have articulated knowledge. They really have their knowledge in everyday practices, which he stressed. And I think one of the hardest and most interesting questions is, how does a movement, even as it develops a theory by which to guide its actions, does not see the theory as anything but a distilling of knowledges that are not discursive, that are not articulate, that are there in the practices, quotidian practices, of ordinary, often illiterate people. And I don't think we've properly come to grips with how that is done. I think there must be some genius that he had by which he understood what people's yearnings are and how those yearnings are not merely desires but cognitions of the world, and how to see the world through their yearnings is something I think he, more than any leader that I know, was able to tap, and it's because of his trust in the judgment of ordinary people and the quotidian forms of their unalienated religious communal lives.
Just reflecting on what Akeel said, I remember the name of one of those geniuses that Gandhi was influenced about and he goes on to write about, and his name was John Ruskin, and he wrote a book called Unto the Last. And Gandhi says he was traveling in a train through South Africa, somebody gave him the book to read, and from the book he began to realize and imagine a state or a country which would create a system which would begin unto the last. From the last. Gandhi took it further because it wasn't just unto the last, but Gandhi turned it into a phrase called Antodaya, uplift of the last. And Gandhi was very preoccupied with that in his listening practices, in his developing theories of change, freedom struggle as he went along. And there are just two anecdotes I want to mention before asking Gloria I have a question in mind for Gloria, but the two anecdotes I remember in his listening of the last is one is that when he was in Champaran and documenting the plight of the indigo farmers, he told his wife, Kasturba, that, I met this woman and there were these women around this pond and they all were wearing very dirty clothes, and why don't you go and teach them about hygiene? And the woman told his wife that go and ask Bapu, Gandhiji, that why does he know that we don't have a second sari? And how can we wash our clothes and have a bath every day and then come to give our testimonies in fresh saris when we don't have a second pair of sari? And will he get us this sari? So his wife comes and tells him, and that is a time when Gandhi is wearing the Gujarati attire of the middle class merchant, which is a turban, a long dhoti, not the short dhoti that you see him in, and like a frock coat, with lots of layers and layers of cloth and a big shawl. And when he hears the story is when he takes off the shawl and the turban and begins to minimize what he wears. So this is the first iteration of the Gandhi image that you see today with the loincloth. And then, of course, he's again organizing mill workers in Ahmedabad with another woman. And when he goes to the mill workers, again, he sees that they don't have enough cloth, and that's when he takes off his kurta. And then finally, the Gandhi in loincloth comes from where he tries to launch homespun across the country as a challenge to the manufacture of British cloth made in Manchester, the Manchester mills. And again, there are laborers in Madras, it was called Madras then, who say that, but British cloth is cheaper than Indian-made cloth, and how do you expect us to change when you yourself are roaming around in these clothes which are fully clad? And then Gandhi takes off and appears in South India in a town, just in loincloth, saying that I will wear the minimum. And then he begins to talk to weavers across the country, again as a learning process, that how could we make the khadi become something which was very cheap, affordable, and include a spinning wheel which anyone could use in their homes, because till then he hadn't perfected the spinning wheel. And the same story, of course, is about his understanding the plight of the Harijan. He was trying to take on caste by doing the most polluting tasks himself, because he really wanted to uproot that hierarchy. So he would create ashrams or communes wherever he had any political action, where he would actually make sure he was cleaning the toilets, he was cleaning the utensils, which are considered polluting tasks in the hierarchy of Brahmanism. And he would weave, he would do agriculture, and through these actions he was trying to prove that there was no hierarchy around work. Gloria, to the question that you addressed was the fact that Kamala Devi told you that he learned everything from women, and how she meant it in a way that he embraced what he was listening from women, but also how it made him a whole, complete person, the oneness of Gandhi, where he embraced his femininity. How else do you think it impacted on movements and feminist struggles?
Well, I think that is one of the great differences about Gandhi, don't you? He was a whole person. He did not divide human qualities into masculine and feminine. He was born into a masculine role and learned everything about the feminine role and became a whole person. And I think that is such a key to why, he continues and endures and appeals to absolutely every one of us. It is essential. And I think there's one other thing, too, which is that, I'm so glad we started with a tribute to the people who lived on this land, and some still live on this land, because they were part of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. And the Iroquois Confederacy happens to have been the inspiration for Marx and Engels. They never actually came here, but they read all about their form of government and structure and so on, and it was what they called primitive communism. All right. They left out they left out women, let's face it, in reproduction, but anyway, they left out something else very, very important, which was that the means are the ends. The ends do not justify the means. That was an absolutely clear principle, and still is. The Haudenosaunee are still alive and well in upstate New York. And Marx and Engels really gave in to the idea, by the nature of their revolutionary instruction, that the ends justify the means, and it was that did them in. And it's actually why M.N. Roy, who was for many years the head of the Communist Party in India, ultimately left the Communist Party and founded the Radical Humanists, because he came to see that the Communist Party's alliance with other countries in various violent and immoral ways meant that they did not understand that the means created the ends, and he left the party. So I think, those two things are I find very helpful, that regardless of how we get born, male or female, we're all whole human beings. We made up gender, we can unmake it up. We made up race and caste, we can unmake it up, right? And that the means we use have to reflect the ends we hope to reach.
I actually do. So let me ask the question that I wanted to pose to both of you. I think it would be shirking on our part not to raise it. See, I completely agree that Gandhi was a whole person in just the sense that you've outlined, Gloria, and it is absolutely true that as public figures and leaders go, he was the least macho of male figures you could find anywhere. In fact, he was killed explicitly by a motivation which said he has made Hinduism effeminate. That was an explicit motivating that was said by the assassin and a whole lot of people around the assassin. And by effeminate, what was meant was that he had tried to equate Hinduism with all of humanity. That is to say, Hinduism just absorbed everything that it encountered, and it was therefore whole, in just the sense you're talking. So that was his sort of maverick conception of Hinduism, so maverick that he was killed, partly, for having that view. But having said all this about his and the view of nature, which John earlier described, he was far ahead of people. I mean, if you've read this wonderful book by Caroline Merchant, who's written this great book called The Death of Nature, where she describes how nature is essentially feminine, and of course that you can have two different views of it. You can see, therefore, all of industrial progress as a kind of rape of a feminine figure, or you could see it as something to be respected. And Gandhi obviously called nature, he openly called it nature a woman, and he had in mind that it should have the very opposite effect of showing respect sufficiently that we eschew industrial ideas of a growth economy. Now, the question so there's both the question both on nature, both on the form of Hinduism that he accepted. He was deeply effeminate in the best sense of the word. But we can't fail to acknowledge that it was a complete failure. We live in an Indian society which is as macho as ever. There's a tremendous amount of domestic violence perpetrated by males. There's a tremendous amount of public violence that is openly, brazenly, and it goes unchecked everywhere. And quite apart from the failure in bringing this wholeness to fruition in India, he also, we just simply have to admit, was a social conservative. That for all his belief in there not being any essential difference and so on, he nevertheless thought that to a considerable extent the professional lives of men and women should be different, and he was in many ways committed to the habits of women's lives being different from men, and there was this pervasive social conservatism. If you take the fact, what everybody quite rightly points out, and which one ought to admire greatly, that he mobilized millions of women, which in a way that nobody had done, and brought them into the public sphere during the revolutionary movement, but it never took the form of women's interests, of women's aspirations. It took the form of national aspirations, of anti-imperial aspirations. But nowhere in that mobilization was, when we have a free nation, we must have, total freedom of women in the way. So that was just simply not part of the achievements of bringing them into the public. And I think we should not shirk these issues around Gandhi.
Well, nobody's perfect. No, I mean, I think he inhabited all human qualities, but he didn't quite recognize that women also could inhabit all human qualities. I would not say that the difference of occupation is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, our own Native American cultures here, which, were definitely not patriarchal. Women tended to control agriculture, men tended to control hunting, but it was equal. Women obviously gave birth and men did not, but men participated in giving birth. So I don't think the difference is necessarily a problem. It's just the balance or the equal valuing of the difference.
Just to add to what you said, that it was a complete failure, I would challenge that, because, it's not been a complete failure, because what the Indian freedom struggle did was that it brought so many women into the public sphere, and there was no going back after that. So they began to get into politics, they began to get into education, they began to get into the public sector, and we had the largest number of female leaders ever in the history of the world. And so women began to participate much more in public life, and they had to figure out more things. Besides that, there were two things that Gandhi did speak about which were specific to women's rights. One was that they should have equal share in property and inheritance, and the other was that the husband's earning should be shared equally with the wife because she assisted him in earning that money. So there were two things where he was very, very specific. And also at one point, there was another woman who challenged him on the system of Devadasis, which is temple prostitution in India. And she literally challenged the entire Congress committee, saying that this practice needs to be banned. And there were some socially conservative congressmen who said, oh, this is traditional, and we can't get rid of this because it affects tradition. And Gandhi actually sided with that gynecologist from Madras and said, no, the Congress must pass a resolution for banning the Devdasi system because it was oppressive to women and to people from certain castes. Because why should they be sexually available for the pleasure of Brahmins and Thakurs and other castes? So there are these three specific instances. The one instance which I think is the elephant in the room when it comes to women is that people always ask that why did he sleep nude with two young women at the fag end of his life? And I would say that Gandhi, towards the end of his life, in the middle of his life actually, began to think that male ego was the reason for much of the violence in the world, and male restraint was the opposite of that. And he himself began to embrace celibacy. And the experiments with truth were also part of that, like his embracing of celibacy as he went on, to the point finally when he does this, he's called the Mahatma. India has become free of colonialism. Nehru is the prime minister. He need not have done anything. At that point, he embarks on this absolutely public experiment of sleeping naked with two women younger than him. And now we have to remember that he did not sexually assault them because he was celibate, but he did sleep naked with them. And what he was trying to drive home is, one is the idea of male restraint, but the other thing he was trying to drive home was that his entire principle through the freedom struggle and his experiments with himself was to overcome fear, shame, and guilt. But the other question which remains hanging in the air, and we'll never know, is that, but those two women, how much did they consent to sleeping naked with him? What was the conversation they had? And if they had a conversation, then how equal was that conversation? Like, could they say no when this man is revered like God almost, India has become free? There is a pamphlet which gives us some clue to that. One of the women writes a pamphlet called Bapu, My Mother, which means Gandhi as her mother. So because he effeminized his own personality over the years, became celibate, began engaging with women in his different ashrams on all kinds of issues, from menstruation to hygiene to cooking to cleaning, everything, that by the time he embarked on this experiment, they just saw him as a mother figure, full of compassion. And this pamphlet is about that. So that gives us some clue to the context of what happened then. And this whole idea that he actually sexually assaulted those women is completely untrue. So just to address that, any comments, anything else that, Akeel?
No. I think that you have supplied the end of the story, or, the motivation, or let me put it this way, the woman who wrote the pamphlet, and you read the pamphlet, that makes all the difference.
Yes, and Akeel, any?
He had this very strange argument for why he was cultivating celibacy. It's a fairly complex argument, and I think it's. I'll say it briefly, though it does nothing whatsoever to show the quite serious inconsiderateness towards young women who were lying by his side and he was naked. But the argument is a completely seriously thought out argument for celibacy, whatever you think of it by way of assessment. He had this view that very central to Gandhi's thinking about politics was that violence is a form of impatience in action. And he was very keen that it was very important for him that politics people in politics should cultivate patience. In this respect, he was very Burkean, very much like Burke. In two respects, he was like Burke. One is that he did not think you should question what is given to you. He did not think that it should be easy to question what is given to you. That you should question it deeply, long and hard, and then act on your decision. So, for instance, he was against conversion by and large because he thought things are just given to you. You're born a Jew or a Christian and so on, and you can't just upturn it, just like you can't just upturn things by a revolution in France or upturn. He was against Warren Hastings because he thought that he was just impertinently upturning a great civilization with his actions in Bengal. So here's the argument for celibacy. So he says impatience is just the source of violence in public life or in politics. And then a whole lot of people wrote to him, including the great English biologist J.B.S. Haldane and so on, wrote to him to say, but listen, the people are desperate sometimes. How can you blame people who are suppressed, oppressed, and are desperate? How can you blame them for being impatient? It's very hard to be patient in your suffering. And so he wrote back to say, you use the word desperate, but desperation, so just as violence is impatience in action, desperation is impatience in mind. It's internal impatience. So violence is external impatience. And he claimed then that sexual arousal was internal, was the paradigm, a very clear case of internal desperation. When you're sexually aroused, you get a kind of, you put aside internal patience for a kind of desperation. That was his sort of understanding, phenomenology of sexual arousal, and therefore he thought it was very important to get nonviolence in public life, in the external sphere, to cultivate this thing in the, get rid of feelings of desperation, of which sexual arousal. So it was this very complicated, even somewhat perverse way of bringing together the outer and the inner, but it was certainly very seriously intended and thought out.
I have a question from Gloria, but Gloria, you go first. I have a question from...
Well, no, this is so a non sequitur in a way, but I think one of the things that made me love Gandhi the most was reading his description of himself when he went to London to read the law and was wearing a very English suit and high-collared shirts and trying to learn how to waltz. I mean, that is where he started, trying to eat meat because that must be what made these colonial people so powerful, trying to learn how to waltz, trying to, when you think of where he started and where he journeyed, how can you not love him?
On that note, Gloria, I have a question for you that, Gandhi was obviously no feminist because there was no feminism in his time, and he learned as he went along. What would your life have been like if you had predated Gandhi? And what would Gandhi have been like if, that's your question, Akeel, that what do you imagine Gandhi's life would have been like had he met Gloria?
I don't know that I would have changed. Well, I did. I mean, I grew up, theosophy was not the same as Gandhi exactly, so I kind of grew up without knowing, and even if I had an intellectual idea, it wasn't the same as walking through villages and seeing it actually happen. You need that all five senses experience. So I certainly took my own sweet time about waking up and seeing that Gandhi was relevant here, not just in India. It took me a while to understand that. And of course, Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez and many other people, made that possible. But how he has helped me, I think, for instance, as a writer, I understand, because of him, that the most radical thing you can be is understandable. That is crucial. And I'm not sure, with the exception of the academics here, who are very understandable, that we always get that, right? That the means are the ends, that behavior, how you behave is, that what they told me, walking around the villages, if you want people to listen to you, you have to listen to them, you want to know how they live, you have to go where they live. I mean, all of that is just so profoundly true that I think I might have clung to my childhood knowledge. You know how kids all over the world say two things: it's not fair and you are not the boss of me? Okay, I think they're Gandhians at birth. But then they get trained the other way, So I don't know if I could have preserved the wisdom of birth and childhood without going to India, without Gandhi.
It's just a personal, biographical personal question. Did you feel, you've done a lot of activist work with First Nation leaders and so on in this country, and you've spent formative years in India. Was there anything in your activism which was similar to Gandhi's, in that you were tapping things that you thought were really properly belonged to religion, even if they were filtered to you through very secularized lenses? But through your experience of solidarities and activism with indigenous groups who aren't part of the standard religions, but have their own understanding of nature, and there's a kind of pagan, a whole range of pagan doctrinal commitments and practices, and your experience in India, which was very formative for you. Do you find that you, for all your very naturally formed modernity, that these things have had a
verging on religion, Yeah. No, I mean, for me, religion and spirituality are two very different things. And monotheism is part of the problem, not the solution, because it personifies and limits and creates a hierarchy, and I guess maybe the roof may fall on me at this moment as a prayer. But I think what Gandhi's spirit says to me, and what my friends in Indian country feel like to me, I don't want to represent them, but is that is that God is in all living things, and that's profoundly different. It is the opposite of hierarchy. It really is, and actually the birth of monotheism it came when God was withdrawn from nature and withdrawn from women, which you can see actually if you ever make that trip on the Nile, you know, you can see in the carvings and so on along the Nile, going from the oldest Nubian part towards Cairo. God is withdrawn from women and nature as it gets more towards the current age in order to make it okay to conquer women and nature. So I would say that religion is really, really different from spirituality. And Gandhi was much more spiritual than religious.
What about Gandhi now? You know, we have brute masculinity again asserting itself in the rise of the strong man, and we have leaders who are like bullies in different countries across the world. So,
because they know they're losing. They are desperate, desperate.
So what is the relevance? What can we do with, you know, we have the wisdom of your own experiences in the country. We have the history of Gandhi as the biggest liberator of humankind in modern history. And we have tactics which can be used to stand up to brute masculinity. So we have all this, and yet, you know, somehow we touch it and it vanishes, and we touch it and it vanishes. Because brute masculinity and, you know, Akeel spoke about Gandhi using religion as a way to mass mobilization. And we have leaders who are also using religion as a way to mass mobilization and almost towards hyper-nationalism. So how is Gandhi relevant now, or do we have to look for different ways of challenging all this?
Well, I think we should ask everybody here, but I'll take advantage. I bet I'm 85. Is there anybody over 85? Okay, I rest my case. All right. So the good thing about being old is you remember when it was worse. This gives you hope. Okay. So what was a movement of maybe 10 or 20% of people with all the social justice movements, and then 30%, and, you know, we were crazies, but we had a little influence. Anyway, now, if you look at the public opinion polls in a kind of big general way, the social justice movements, the gay and lesbian movement, the women, you know, all, and the environmental movement now have influenced the majority opinion. And really, you know, and also, in a very short order, this country is no longer going to be a colonized majority white country. We will be a majority people of color country. So for both those reasons, we have 30 or 40% of the country in full backlash and full Trumpian, you know, as Trump says, if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue, they would still vote for him. So this does not mean it's not dangerous just because they're not the majority, and they could still win. But I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, it is very different from where we started.
Maybe we should let that be the last word.
You don't have anything to say about the relevance of Gandhi now?
In India?
Everywhere, anywhere. India, you can talk about it, yeah.
You know, I think Gandhi was a very early figure in what we would now call the environmental movement. Very profound, and it has to do with just the sorts of things that Gloria mentioned about the desacralization of nature, which he was deeply concerned about and was an essential part of his modern opposition to modernity. I think one of the questions that Gandhi raised, I know you want me to say something about Modi, and I'm happy to be able to do that, but I do want to put a question to to all of you, people here and there, which I think might seem a little academic, but I think it's really a hard question, and I don't know what I think about it. But Gandhi raised it, and that is, all of us are constantly making a distinction which is not, for instance, Gloria made the distinction between religion and spirituality. There's a similar distinction, by analogy, that people tend to make between science and technology, industry, pollution, and things like that. You know. They tend to think science is one thing. Science just studies the world. It comes up with laws and predictions. It has a detached study of the world. And then there's technology, and you should keep them separate. You shouldn't be anti-scientific just because you think that there's an environmental problem and so on. Science is just different from technology. Now, that is absolutely correct. Anybody who denies that is simply not getting a very basic distinction. But Gandhi raised a question nevertheless, that once you have scientific knowledge and laws and explanations and so on, are you predisposed to ruining the environment, using people as a means, making technology so central that so it's not as if he's denying the distinction between science and technology. He's too intelligent to do that. But he's nevertheless saying, does the creation of a certain knowledge weaken us? Just by the fact of possession of knowledge. We are disposed to then use it towards certain purposes. And you just can't avoid that just by noticing a separation between the two. And I think that's something that I don't know the answer to, and it's because you don't know what is it for Newton's laws to dispose us to pollute the environment. There are about 1,000 missing steps from the one to the other. But nevertheless, it seems as if we ought to ask, does it happen? And he thought it did, and I'm not sure he's right.
And we'll open up the floor to questions, but I was just thinking of one quick thought, that one of the most relevant things that Gandhi offered was that he went beyond nationalism. So in his dying days, he actually wanted to shift from India to Pakistan because he thought Pakistan had a raw deal when India and Pakistan were divided into two countries. Also, his book called Village Swaraj, which is the independence of village India, he wanted to create self-sustaining communities where people would live together through a barter system in a more equal way, rather than like one huge nation state. So he was beyond that. And I think today, when religion is being used to create this hyper-nationalism, I think Gandhi would have said that people are more important and we have to put people in the center. And if that hyper-nationalism actually consumes people, it's not worth it. Questions?
Or answers. We can use answers.
Yes, please get up.
Thank you, Ruchira, Gloria. It's a great day today that I get to see you, ma'am, Gloria. Growing up in India, you were one of the first people we knew as the face of feminist movement, and that created a lot of groups in our college that pushed for women's equality and many things going forward. Thank you first. I thought I could add just two little insights on the question about Gandhiji's practice of celibacy, and especially since Gloria encouraged us to come up with answers. So one insight comes from a song that he held as one of his guiding lights or guiding principles of life. It's Vaishnava Janto Tene Kahiji. So that song tells you about how should an ideal Vaishnava or a person who's a devotee of Vishnu, how should he be? And there's a paragraph, or 2 verses in the 3rd paragraph, where it said, the song is written by Nursi, and it says, Samadrishti ne Trishna Tyagi, Parastri jene matre, Mohamaya vyapye nahi jene, Dhruda vairagya jena manmare. So translating, what it means is, ultimately your goal should be, you renounce craving of all sorts, and particularly respect other women who are not your wife as your own mother. And you do this by maintaining dhrad vairagya, or complete celibacy and renunciation of your lower desires. So that was one of his guiding principles, and he was moving towards that. That's all. Thank you.
Don't you think it's interesting that they're termed lower desires? Why are they lower desires? No, I mean, I think we need to think about that, you know, because why is an orgasm not also a spiritual experience?
Hi, I'm picking up on that theme, and then also on the request that we share a little bit about our journey with Gandhi. When I was 29 and 30, I was on my own spiritual quest. I was volunteering with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in Alaska, and I really was trying to understand what it meant to live one's faith. And so reading Gandhi's memoirs, My Experiments in Truth, it was just a very deep dive, and I felt like I learned a lot. You know, there was reference to popular religion, but I experienced the way he talked about his faith as just a very deep devotion that connected him to other people. And when he was talking about celibacy, he talked all about these philosophies, and he discerned, and he prayed, and he talked with his male companions and friends about it. And as he's writing about this, he says, and then I decided, and I went home and I told my wife. And I was so disappointed because, again, whatever sexuality was and whatever, it didn't seem to be relational. And maybe that's a cultural perspective that I was putting on it. But I was wondering what the gap was there, that there could be so much thought, but that after he made the decision, he went home and told his wife that it wasn't, that it didn't even occur to him that she would participate in that. So that was, and I nonetheless have been very moved and inspired by him in many ways.
Well, nobody's perfect, right? But I mean, the great thing about Gandhi was that he was always revising himself, you know. So I agree that I went home and told my wife is very different from I went home and asked my wife, or talked to my wife, or listened to my wife. But he was capable of change, and maybe that's the best we can ask of each other.
Hi, good evening, and my name is Raji, and Raji Deyat Mangalam, and I'm really happy to be here this evening. I was thinking about science and technology, and I was a life scientist for about 17 years before I went back to school to be a social worker. And so when I think about what science and technology and knowledge, and there's a lot of evidence-based movements all over the country in many fields, and I think what it does, in my mind, is it creates, it's not so much that science is the problem or technology is the problem, but I think you said something about articulated knowledge and experiential knowledge that's been in all cultures for eons. When articulated knowledge becomes the knower and the expert and uses that to oppress the so-called masses who have in their bones and in their spirits and across generations, they know. And so when it creates this false dichotomy of something that can be seen and measured as the only thing we know, starts to rule over the oppressed people, or actually turn people into oppressed people, I think to me that's a problem. And in the work of a social worker, that's the first thing we're told, is that the client or participant or patient is the person who owns their story entirely, at least in the very beginning. We go in as a learner. So as long as science and technology comes from the stance of stepping back and learning, as opposed to wanting to teach, as if people and the masses are empty vessels, like Paulo Freire said, then we don't have a problem. That's my thought. That's my initial thought.
Any others? There was somebody else I saw.
I actually do want to say something. I think those are very brilliant remarks. I completely agree with you. And I think it is an essential part of Gandhi's thinking that he thought, just as you said, in fact you said it more elegantly than he does, that there is no difference between the transformation of nature into natural resources and the difference between knowledges to expertise. He says that they're the same transformations. They're at bottom the same transformation. Now he went even further. He went further to say that the transformation of human beings to citizens is also the same transformation. Now that's a very, very deep thought. And I'm not sure that it is something we can easily understand and speak about in a brief while. But he actually said that the transformation of nature to natural resources and the transformation of knowledges to live by into expertise to rule by are exactly the same transformation. And he added to it, and so, by the way, is, I'm sort of collating things in different parts of his corpus. So, and he actually then said the transformation of human beings into citizens is also a kind of reduction of human beings. And that's a little more than what you said, but it is worth bringing into the horizon of your very shrewd remarks.
So I want to ask a quick, well, maybe not a quick question, but a key question about one other hierarchy that I think I'd like to hear you guys address. And that's the hierarchy between knowing and feeling, which I think is also being complicated in all kinds of ways in Gandhi's thinking. Not least because knowing is not the referential adequacy of propositions to reality, but something like the congruence of persons to the real.
Actually, we can put that question to Gloria in a very specific way because she experienced this country in a way that I didn't because I wasn't here. But you remember, Gloria, that editorialists wrote about what was terrible in Vietnam, what America was doing in Vietnam. Professors spoke from time to time in universities, so there were all sorts of knowledges that were coming out of new media and so on. But one picture of the My Lai, remember the picture? That mobilized millions of people in a way that all these editorials and lectures and all failed to do. And so there's something about the point he's making about the difference between knowing and seeing, that there's something about the visual that just simply makes people respond with a kind of, and you lived through this.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I guess knowing can be more distant than seeing. And the photograph you're talking about is the little girl, right? Yeah. Having been burned by napalm and so on, running nude toward, and the interesting thing is I just came from South Korea at a conference about unification of North and South Korea, in which that little girl was a major speaker as a grown-up. And she has written a book I recommend to all of you called Fire Road. It's about her life since then. She's living in Australia, I think. She's married, has children and grandchildren. For a long time she felt trapped by that, tried to forget it. finally realized that, that this was her life experience and her destiny. And really, it's a wonderful book, Fire Road. You will see her whole journey and how that experience, once she got to the place where she realized that the final stage of healing is using what happened to you to help other people, because then you know it's not wasted.
We can take one more question. There's a lady at the back. No? Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you, Akeel, and thank you, Gloria. There is a question? Oh no, John, there's one more question. I think somebody just put up their hand. Did you see a hand earlier? No, he was. Oh, okay. So thanks everyone. Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Akeel, and thanks, John.
In addition to the speakers, whom we've just now thanked, we also ought to thank, again, once more, Mary Coelho, our funder, for making this entire evening possible. We also obviously owe you all a thanks for coming out in what turned out to be a bit of a rain. So we're grateful for you to be present. But there's also all manner of invisible work that happens in order for us to have such conversations. There are people who put up these lovely wraps and put on our facilities people and our PR folks. So there are just a number of people who made it possible for us to have the conversation we've just had. So let's also be mindful of them and offer our thanks as well to them. And be on the lookout for future events from the Insight Project and from Union Theological Seminary. Again, thanks all.